Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming to tonight's meeting, Saturday night at Marxism 2017. My name is Sasha Simic. I'm an activist with Hackney SWP and a shop steward in Usdaw. And normally, well, for the last 5 years, I've been doing the geek spot at Marxism. And you've had Doctor Who from me, you've had Star Trek, you've had my take on superheroes and Marxism or whatever, which is all very good, very very well. But you know, I'm a consumer. I'm not a producer of this material that I think many of us love in this room. So you know, we're very very privileged, I think, tonight to have a key member of the British comic industry, a man whose work started with the DC Thompson line, the comedy joke titles that came out in the 70s that used to be around for a long time. He went to IPC, Fleetway. He worked in the girls' comic genre, which doesn't exist anymore, which is a great shame, I think. And then went on to create a number of seminal works, one of which was the comic Action, which there was all sorts of problems and trouble with. And from Action came 2000 AD. Now, we're celebrating a lot of things this year, not least the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which is great, but we're also celebrating the 40th anniversary of 2000 AD. And I think if 2000 AD survived, it survived because it was built on very good foundations, and our speaker tonight was there right at the beginning and helped build those foundations and fashion it into the important cultural work that it actually is. I'll just explain how it's going to work. I'm going to ask Pat to speak. He'll speak for 30 minutes. And then afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for you to, make your observations, questions, disagreements, and the rest of it. Pat's just finished, has just produced Serial Killer, a prose novel that, will be a part of a series. We hope that people will buy it and read it and enjoy it. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And he's also produced an ebook on the history of 2000 AD and his thoughts about the comic industry, which I finished and I can highly recommend. It's very, very good. Come and get the details off me afterwards, but you won't regret buying either. Pat, take it away, please.
Right. Well, first of all, it's great to be here because with a lot of events, I have to sort of self-censor myself with, but I can actually, come out with, where I'm coming from, which is a very similar perspective to you guys. So that makes me feel very comfortable being here. I just want to start by saying just a little bit about popular culture in general. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, so the kind of stuff I was reading would have been James Bond, Sherlock Holmes, Richard Hannay, Scarlet Pimpernel, Dennis Wheatley, all that kind of stuff. And it's only as I sort of gradually moved into teenage years and adult years that I realized this stuff is all written by upper middle class people and their upper class heroes, and we have very, very few working class heroes. You could say perhaps Harry Potter maybe fits the bill. I don't know, but there are all these upper class characters, and I think as I started to write comics, it took me a while to really work out a philosophy of it. But I think, in a nutshell, I think it's deliberate. I think there is an attempt to stop working class heroes being positive images of working class characters. They're invariably sidekicks, often a reason for parody. They're the loyal Batman, all that kind of stuff. I won't go too deeply into it because I'll start ranting and get distracted from but that is definitely the case. And I mention in this book, Be Pure, Be Vigilant, Behave, one example of that where I was commissioned to do a Doctor Who screenplay. And I really fell out with the script editor because he said, you cannot have a working class spaceship captain. It's impossible. Now, this would be maybe just before Alien, where I think or Aliens, where you started to see blue-collar workers in science fiction. But he was absolutely adamant he was against it. And I even featured a working-class family, which, again, he wasn't happy with. I could cite other examples, but I'm sure we're all on the same page here. And so that really motivated me. I mean, I think it took a while for me to actually articulate it. It was just... Initially, it was like, I'm not going to have any officers in my stories, and it's only after a while, perhaps as you get older, you step back, you think, why am I so uptight about that? And it is because I was fed non-stop stuff. I mean, often very, very good stories. I mean, these are great writers, but they are writing on behalf of the establishment. And I would actually go so far as to say it is sinister. If you look at the character of John Buchan, for example, he was the spin doctor of World War I, and he was better than Alistair Campbell, the Tony Blair's guy. Is it? I mean, things were really designed to con people, and I think the more I became aware of this, the more perhaps angry I got. And that's why Battle, Action, and 2000 AD often get very satirical and very angry. So that, if you like, is the background. And I think it probably affected my peers as well, with if you probably see them a bit later, some of these crazy images from 2000 AD. So I suppose what I'm attempting to do is to articulate what motivated a lot of us, because we largely come from working class backgrounds and we all seem to have axes to grind. And I think comics gives us a great opportunity to do that because, first of all, to a large extent, they were ignored, apart from Mary Whitehouse, who objected to the violence and all that kind of stuff. But it was that's just a kid's comic. And... So they were ignored for a long while, and when, for instance, I did a series, Charlie's War, which was very, very anti-war, because it was popular, the publisher doesn't care. It's that wonderful thing with capitalism. As long as it's making money, they don't care. So I was thinking, God, I'm getting away with all kinds of stuff. And I think the only thing I had a problem with, a really stupid editor, and I thought, no, I've got to let this go. And you'll see why in a moment. It was because we had the American soldiers had come over in 1917, and there was a scene where some Ku Klux Klan guys were being roughing up a black soldier. Charlie comes to his aid and everything. And the editor said, well, we don't want to be controversial. And I really had to bite my fucking tongue on that, But the reason I bit my tongue was because I had the British invasion of Russia lined up just around the corner of 1919. And I thought, let this one go. And, I could have kicked up a fuss and they could have shut me down. And I thought, to show that Britain invaded Russia. Was it 20, 30,000 soldiers alongside? I mean, it was mentioned. I'm sure it's been mentioned at several events today. I thought, no, it's worth it. Just hold on to that. So that, if you like, is the background, to things. I mean, I personally face three challenges in comics, and they're all kind of connected with 2000 AD, and they're obviously political in one form or another. The first one is girls' comics, and I just mentioned that as a brief aside, just to tell you that girls' comics outsold boys' comics by 2 to 1. And that shouldn't really come as a surprise to any of us, because women read far more than we do as a rule. So why did they disappear? Because it's a guy's sandpit, because the fanboys took over and they just let it drop. It's more complicated than that. But if I tell you that a comic like Tammy was selling 250,000 copies a week to an age group of 8 to 12, something like that, that gives you an idea. And 2000 AD, by comparison, was selling 200,000 copies a week. So there's that huge potential, and it's one of my particular bugbears. After 10 years of ranting, I've managed to persuade the publishers to reprint some girls' comics, and of course they're selling very well. And annoyingly, and I'll come back to this later, they're charging insane prices for them, which I find loathsome. They're charging like 17 quid for 2 serials in a flimsy, this sort of material. It's just wrong. And so they're not reaching, if you like, ordinary school kids. They're maybe reaching their mums, but it's taking it out of ordinary people's price range. And but anyway, that's a separate rant. There's only so many rants you can have in a lifetime. So I have to say, no, I'm going to let that one go. But to give you an idea of the importance of girls' comics, they were often more seditious. I mean, 2000 AD is renowned for its sedition, and rightly so. But girls' comics actually were, in many ways, more seditious because they had all kinds of weird psychological stuff going on. I won't get into it other than to just mention one classic example, Ella on Easy Street. Now, with most stories, the heroine or her family are aspirational. But in Tammy, this particular heroine, she sees her family, they're trying too hard. The dad's taking on 2 jobs, mum's going to night school, and so they're losing their sense of being a family. And she sets out to sabotage their yuppie dreams. Now, that's an incredibly seditious idea, and I didn't write this one. I would have been honoured to have written it. It's too long a story to tell you about it, other than to say it's probably online somewhere. Ella on Easy Street, beautiful artwork by Casanovas, and I suppose that the nearest comparison, I was talking to Sasha about it earlier, was The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which again you couldn't show a film like that today. We were saying if you said to a Hollywood producer, so the end of the film is the guy throws the race because he just says that to the system. You just can't do that. But I think to present a story like Ella on Easy Street with all the and it's not straightforward. There's for and against her point of view. Maybe her family wanted to, get on in life and all the rest of it. But it's saying to kids, that isn't materialism. Isn't the be all and end all. Solidarity, comradeship, and everything else. So I think that was a fantastic story to be hitting 8 and 9-year-old. I can't imagine what effect it had on them, but I bet there's a lot of women out there who are really moved by that story. So the next challenge for me, of course, is with 2000 AD, our readership grew up with us, which is fantastic. It's great on many levels because kids are actually can be very rude when you see them at conventions. They used to, when we started off, and they'd be like, I don't know, say 12, 13, something like that. They'd go around the different tables and they go, no, I don't like your stuff. Your stuff sucks. So it's really good. It's really good having an older readership because you might feel that, but you're far too polite to say anything, or at least I hope you are. So there's a lot of advantages from our point of view, but there are disadvantages as well. And I think, one of the arguments is, and it's complete crap, is that, it's to do with changing demographics, it's to do with computer games and everything else. It's simply not true. We fumbled the ball, we lost our readership. And the proof of that is if you look at Games Workshop, they still have their readership. If you go to France, French kids, they have all the computer games and things, and they still love comics. We fumbled the ball. We got it wrong. Too big a story as to how we got it wrong. But the important thing for me is I'd like to get those readers back. I want to get new generations of kids reading comics. I don't know whether that will happen with 2000 AD because I think that the publisher and the editorial staff don't know how to do it. And writing for 9 or 10-year-old kids, is much hard. You guys are much more tolerant than, when you were 9 or 10, you would probably remember just how intolerant you were, because if they didn't like a story, my God, you get this hate mail would come pouring through. And we had to respond to them. So we actually had a kind of love-hate relationship with our readers, because we'd write maybe a particularly good story, and then the editor would say, no, readers didn't like it this week, because they voted on it week by week. So you had instant feedback. And we think, but that was the best episode. What's wrong with the little shits? You know, you kind of, you'd feel really kind of quite. And I think there's a little bit of me in the main character in here, who's a kind of W.C. Fields sort of guy who works on kids' comics, but he doesn't like them, and then he changes and so on and so forth. But so I think the thing is, for me personally, and again, it took me a while to realize this. I didn't just sit down one day and say, I'm going to write subversive comics for kids that are going to, alter their minds about things. It was always there, but I think it's taken me quite a while. Maybe it's something as you get middle-aged and beyond, you sort of think, why am I doing this? Because there's easier ways to make a living. You can just write crap all the time, and writing subversive stories takes a bit more effort, I think. And I think the reason is it's for whatever reason, it's what I'm meant to do, and I don't think I could write anything else now. So it does concern me whether or not we can reach kids, and I should probably read you this letter. It's a 2000 AD fan letter sent to me, and it's from the CEO of a school. And reading his letter, I don't think he's going to be receiving an MBE anytime soon. So this is what he has to say. Dear Pat, when people ask me how my moral compass developed, I always say that it was from 2000 AD. I learnt about fascism from Dredd, racism from Strontium Dog, feminism from Halo Jones, and most people just think I'm weird saying this. I'm now 44, and I've been working in education for many years, and have recently opened up a new school in my hometown of Doncaster. Myself and Andy, our principal, are both comic readers, punks, and want our kids to be open-minded, questioning, and challenging. We've both refused invitations to Downing Street and Buckingham Palace that arrived because we've opened a school. It's interesting how the establishment really wants to lock people into their system. I really just wanted to drop you a line to say thank you for all the subversive and subliminal plot lines and stories I've read over the years written by you. It worked. Creating a world-class education free for our children is the most subversive thing I believe I could do. Keep it up, and so will we. Best wishes, Gwyn ap Harry, a not-so-evil CEO. And I think that's lovely. I mean, it sums up, it kind of crystallized a lot of my kind of thinking. As, why am I doing this? Why do I always write these kind of stories? So it's nice to know that the message of 2000 AD, all that subversion and so on, is certainly reaching his kids. I would like it to reach a lot more, and I don't know if it's actually going to happen. I mean, as you probably know, British comics have pretty much disappeared, apart from 2000 AD, and it largely has a readership who are in their 30s or 40s. It does have a few kids, but not enough. And they, as I say, they don't have that attitude that they want to do these kind of stories. So I think it's going to come elsewhere. And I just mentioned that briefly because I think an important thing really is, you were saying, I'm a producer, but comics should be produced by everyone. I mean, if you think of, say, music, you have someone strumming a guitar or someone in a rock band, and it should be the same with comics. And it isn't at the moment. It's incredibly bloody difficult for I mean, and a lot of people get stuck trying to work for 2000 AD. And my advice in this book is don't bother. Because I've had friends who've tried for decades, and the answer is you don't have the problem, 2000 AD has the problem. In other words, some of the dynamic stories you may remember with affection, some of them still go on today, but I think it's not as ballsy as it once was, because some of my peers are no longer working for 2000. Alan Moore, for instance, did Halo Jones, and I think that's it. You know, he'll never come back to 2000. John Wagner wrote some wonderful dreads, and he still does from time to time. But, you know, it's gone on to... It becomes, again, as I say in the book, it's like you end up with all this Dredd merchandising, Dredd pajamas and things like that, and it's rather lost its way. So I just want to say a little bit briefly about, for anybody who is thinking in terms of producing their own material, to say whether it's comics or text, it is possible. I think we often feel, oh, God, we can't do it. And I say that coming from a very working class background and, you know, lying my way into journalism and getting a job and all the rest of it. It's bloody hard. And so I just want to mention a couple of things that I think are encouraging. First of all, it's not a comic exactly, but it's similar. Small press product called Join the Army, like prison, but with more fighting. And the guy who did it, I'm pretty certain. I met him last week in Glasgow, and he passed this over to me. I'm pretty certain he's the guy who made the film Action Man Battlefield Casualties, which some of you may have seen. And it's on YouTube, and you're welcome to take some of these cards away with you as a reference. I was so jealous of it, or envious, let's say. I mean, I just thought, God, this is so brilliant. It goes beyond Charlie's War and beyond, I think, a lot of our satire in 2000 AD, because it just shows up the Ministry of Defence for what it is, that you know, all these guys who are just being treated as cannon fodder. Nothing's changed over the centuries. So I think if someone can do something like that, and that's the other thing with him, he's a kind of Banksy sort of character. I think he's I think you describe him as a guerrilla artist. He puts up these anti-Tory posters everywhere. So he's certainly someone to look out for, and maybe he's someone who should come to Marxism on our future occasion. A smashing chap. I mean, as I say, I only met him for 10 minutes. I just thought, wow. It's so good to know that there are, you know, subversive people, I don't know, somewhere in his 20s, something like that, and he's putting this stuff out. Another incident I should mention, I think that the text novel market, Pulp Fiction, right, which is a cousin of comics after all. I know everyone would love to do comics, but the thing with Pulp Fiction is it doesn't cost you hardly anything to produce. And that's the thing. It gets it back to a democracy of publishing, because at the moment, those bastards have really sewn it up. You probably know that in paper book publishing, like Random House pretty much own every damn thing. So you think of Hodder and Stoughton or Jonathan Cape or whoever it is, it's all Random House. And they have one political perspective, which is not the one we share here. You know, you probably know all this about interns. So if you go into journalism in London as an intern, right, you've got to come from a posh upper middle class family. So otherwise you're fucked. So I think to have an alternative with the independent publishing, Pulp Fiction, is viable, and that really is bringing good news, which you may not know about, because I mean I'm developing this side of things, and we spoke to an author at Brighton who was knocking out real Pulp Fiction, some kind of zombie apocalypse. But that's not the point. The point is he started 2 years ago. He produced 7 novels, all online, so the cost is minimal. In other words, it's really making it democratic. You don't have to go cap in hand to Random House or Jonathan Cape and go, please, sir, give me a job. In other words, fuck them. You can actually take control. And this guy is pulling in, and we saw the sales figures, so I know he's not bullshitting. He's pulling in 3K plus a month. So he's making a living. And he says himself he's not a particularly good writer. He's not known. So you see my point. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to have a name. You may have to... I think this is my particular trademark. I tend to write in kind of things that look innocent enough. Like Charlie's War. It's a story about a soldier in World War I. That doesn't sound too perverse, and it's only as you get into it you realise it's a complete attack on the system. So in a similar way, if you were going to, if you are of a similar mind, let's say, you might start off with a zombie apocalypse, and then you doubtless get into all the, whatever is really on your mind. In other words, the trick with popular culture and pulp fiction is to make it look like, like Mills and Boon or Dennis Wheatley or James Bond or whatever, and then you subvert it from within. And that's really all I've been doing in comics, because I want to reach a wide audience and I want to reach kids. I also want to eat, so that's a factor as well. So, for instance, I did Crisis with Third World War, and I still want to come back to that. And the publishers are not playing ball. And I know deep down it's because it's political. It's really full-on political. It's all about politics of food. So they go, oh, yeah, we're going to do it soon, because obviously they can see my rather, full-on sort of character. So the easiest thing to do is just bullshit me. And they're fairly good at it. But one publisher was saying to me that he would like to do some crisis-type material about ordinary heroes, which is very close to my heart. I mean, there's so many ordinary heroes, so many ordinary, people just in all walks of life. Let's say they're in prison, or they're a Hunt Sab, or they're a cop who fights against corruption, or, ordinary people's stories. And he wanted to do a collection of these, and I've asked him to go away and have a think about it as to how to do it, because the obvious way that these things get done, I'm against, which is you have a big collection, you charge 20 or 25 quid for it, right? And, it's read by the converted, and it gets a great review in The Guardian, but you're not reaching anyone. Whereas what I'd like to do, I'd like to have stories about any kind of ordinary, I say ordinary in quotes, person, but maybe sell it for, let's say, a couple of quid, something like that, so it can still reach kids, rather than it become a North London coffee table book. So that's one of my challenges, if you like. And one of the stories that I'm particularly keen on working on, I'm going to take my time because I've got to get it right. If I do it, either it might be in comic book form, or it might be in text form, and that's John S. Clarke, who may well be familiar to you. I think if he was around today, he'd be writing comics. He's got that kind of sensibility. He's described as a parliamentarian, a poet, and a lion tamer. He was Britain's youngest lion tamer, and he also wrote the most seditious poetry. But just to give you an idea, he's a kind of like a Scottish Tom Baker Doctor Who, and he wrote a pamphlet. He was a prominent member of the Socialist Labour Party and later the Communist Party of Great Britain. And so he'd write pamphlets about, for instance, there's one he wrote against, It was written in response to a court case of the time when several revolutionary Marxists, influenced by the tactics of Sinn Féin, were found guilty of conspiring to use explosives in a terrorist campaign against the state. The pamphlet is a denunciation of the use of terrorism in order to achieve revolutionary aims, and argues that workers' power and control of industry will only be achieved through adoption of the tactics of direct action. Now, there's more to him than that. He ran an escape line for British soldiers in World War I. He was a pacifist, but he was no. The usual argument about pacifism is, oh, they're just cowards. Well, this guy is a guy who stuck his head in a lion's mouth, and obviously you can see where where my title is going to be. It's going to be Lion Tamer, and the lion will obviously be the lion of the British Empire. There's a lot more to him than that, but maybe I should just end by he also wrote the most rude poetry of its day. It's just a fantastic character. You think, well, my first thought, of course, is why hasn't anyone made a TV drama or a movie about this guy? Well, as I started at the beginning, look at the BBC, you say, oh, we can't have a working class captain. That's why. I mean, I've talked to Radio 4 and various radio people about Charlie's War, and I've mentioned this guy as well. And it will reach a certain level. You get the young producers and things, they'll say, hey, this guy's great. And then they pass it up the line to their bosses, and their bosses go, no, we'll pass on it. So I sort of feel, damn, he's Scottish. Why am I doing this? Why isn't a Scottish writer doing this? But anyway, someone's got to do it. So it's got to be me. And I'll just quote, just to end off, this poem he wrote, which was a parody of Kipling's If. And it became, and you can imagine how the Scots felt about Kipling at the time. It became tremendously popular and was pinned up in workshops and shipyards on the Clyde. I'll only read you about 4 verses. If you can get up in the early dawn, say 5 o'clock or even 4:30, and winter's howling, snowy blizzard scorn in one mad gallop to the factory door, if eating muck you labour hard all day mid soot and stink and noisy wheels and bolts, until your back is bent, your hair is grey, and the brain inside your skull sags in and melts. If you can see your wife and kiddies lack the joys and pleasures you yourself create for parasites who live upon your back, and view with unconcern their wretched fate, if you can do these things with easy mind and live and die in slums with swine's content, to every social ill be deaf and blind, and leave it all to God and Parliament, then there is but one thing left for you to do. For mankind's sake, go out and buy a gun and blow your rotten brains to bits, for you have got no guts, my son. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was wonderful. I'm going to open up now. Don't be shy. We've got plenty of time. The way it will work is, you put your hand up. I'll ask you to the front because we're recording this meeting and we're filming it. And you'll have up to 3 minutes to speak. After 2 minutes, I'll tap or clap or cough or something. And then if you run over, I'll tell you to shut up, please. And then we'll invite Pat to come back in the last 10 minutes of the meeting, and then you'll be welcome to pick up some books and stuff like that. So who's going to put their hand up? And let's not have this usual Marxism stuff where nobody does, and for the first 20 minutes, and then we'll take the comrade at the back, then you, and then you.
Thank you, Pat, for a belated thank you, really, from my 12-year-old self, because I was a big consumer of comics, 2000 AD, but also its antecedents, sort of action and battle and all the war comics. But it does seem that was a different era, and these comics were of a different time. And it was a time, really, when there was a transition from the war comics, which is what I was reading first off, and those are the ones which were reinforced by my grandfather's stories of how he fought in the desert and up through Italy, and there was this sort of jarring between what you were reading in sort of Warlord or Battle and the Commando comics, and some of the stories he was telling you about washing in paraffin and sand and mending tanks and all the rest of it. And then we got the subversion that we got in things like Action, which was very good, which turned it, the twist with Hellman's heroes taking it from a German point of view and setting it in the Russian front and all of that sort of thing. And I could never quite understand why that suddenly disappeared. But then along came 2000 AD, which was... It was strange at first because it had Dan Dare was the main thing, not Judge Dredd, who was the main character. Dan Dare was the first one on the cover. And that had sort of echoes back to The Eagle, and my dad got interested in it. That's, I think, why I was allowed to buy it, even though it was supposedly a subversive comic in a conservative type household. But, I mean... The stories seem to be longer, and they seem to have unusual perspectives. There was one about the Russians invading Britain, and there was a Volgans, I think they weren't called Russians, but there was a lorry driver who was the hero of the resistance movement. And it was so interesting to have different perspectives is put across. And they were quite long stories, 5-7 pages, if I remember rightly. So you didn't get too many in a comic. But it was an ephemeral thing, a comic. You bought 2 or 3 a week, or if you were lucky enough to have enough pocket money to buy 2 or 3 a week, and you read them and you perhaps passed them on, or you kept them in a little pile. But they were something which you were consuming in the same way that you were consuming chocolate bars or sweets if you were lucky enough to do that. They were little treats which you sort of enjoyed and then passed on and consumed. Whereas now, I don't even... Somebody was telling me a little bit earlier about comic shops and things, and very occasionally, if I'm bored, I go into some of these things, or I see something in Waterstones, and it's about 20 quid, and it's a reverential document that you sort of put on up there on your bookcase along with your copy of Das Kapital or whatever. You perhaps read it before. I'm being a bit silly, but it is this stupid thing that you've got up on the bookcase, and it's no longer something that you're trashing away with your copies of Socialist Worker, and that's really. I think we've lost something, and I think modern kids have lost something by the demise of the British comic industry, because it was certainly a big thing in my childhood. Not just nostalgia, but it's a question really as to where kids can be introduced to those subversive ideas, because this prevent agenda, to sort of ground it in the reality of the modern day, this prevent agenda could mean that they could say that you were contaminating kids with subversive ideas, and I think we've got to watch that prevent agenda, then that it doesn't spill over into any idea that challenges the authority as such and what the dominant ideas are, because who knows, we would be probably shut down. Thank you, Pat, for my 12-year-old self.
Thanks, that was a fantastic meeting. I wanted to talk a bit about, because I suppose I'm a bit further on. I mean, my mum has always been hugely into 2000 AD. I remember the comics being all over the house growing up. But I wasn't into comics when I was a kid, because I remember even by then there wasn't a lot of cheap comics. This is in the 90s, and I don't remember seeing them anywhere. But I remember as a teenager, what I did get into when I was just starting to get the internet in my house was fan fiction. And there's a lot of it. And we're talking, I ended up accidentally becoming an editor on fanfiction.net when I was about 14. We're talking people would write whole, qualms of Harry Potter, but Harry Potter in a revolution, or Harry Potter where everybody's gay, or Harry Potter, however you want to do Harry Potter. That was my main one anyway. And we've now got to a point where fan fiction is getting published. I mean, isn't that what 50 Shades of Grey is? That was fan fiction that got published and is expensive now, apparently. I don't know, I didn't buy it. But it's one like this. I mean, I suppose you were saying about Pulp Fiction. That seems to be what we find a lot of today, is this free, open, huge books you can get online for now. And some of them aren't bad, I'm not going to lie. But I've started seeing some cheap and free comics again in zines. That, there's not huge amounts of them, but I'll end up, I'll go to a little punk show, and there's a bunch of zines there, and people have drawn their own comics in them, and they're doing little bits and bobs. They might go on the internet as well. They said, if you go on me on Tumblr, I've got my comic here. And I don't know what you thought of, because I don't know if zines are still coming back, or whether I just go to very particular punk shows. But whether that is something that could be a way of getting more cheaper comics, because as the last comrade said, they are expensive these days, unfortunately. And yeah, we want to get more out there, innit?
Sorry, before you afterwards, the young comrade there. Anybody else want to show your hands, something like that? You next, Steve.
I must agree with the idea that for male readers, it's really hard to actually read something enjoyable. My mum turned around to me once and said, when I was in my teenage years, read this, Adrian Mole, 13 3/4. I fucking hated it. I went through it. I fucking loathed it. It put me off reading for about 5 years. It was that appalling. I thought, if that's reading for enjoyment, let me get a rope now. So I'm trying to get my daughter into reading, and I think actually try to pick up on your bit about female characters. There's quite a few out there at the moment, which I find enjoyable. There's Red One. Red One is about a story where there's a right-wing group in America trying to get presidency, and the Russians are worried. It's all in the 1970s, so they send over a superhero to pose as an American superhero, but she's got a big hammer and sickle and goes around trying to stop the right wing. Very strict, I thought. But unfortunately, they're very lazy writers. They produce 2 comics a year. So thanks, guys. Keep it going. Another one's called Paper Girls. Paper Girls is a fantastic story about paper girls, and they've got a lovely adventure, and you got women going into the shop. Would this be good for my daughter? Is your daughter a teenager? Do you know how teenagers talk? This got a lot of swearing in it because they're teenagers. It's well written. It's gone to 2 books. Harley Quinn, Gwenpool, not bad for staple. Lady Mechanica, sort of steampunk. For some reason, she woke up one day to find out someone's done some surgery on her and replaced all her limbs with metal arms and legs. And she goes off kicking arse, etc. Dan Slott's She-Hulk in the 2000s, very, very enjoyable. And I know you've mentioned Miss Marvel, which again, the Muslim superhero. As for 2000 AD, I think I was looking at John Newsinger's work earlier on. The shift from Dan Dare for the future, Dare for that lovely world of fantasy and ever-expanding capitalism, Dare to be great and achieve. Then you had a crisis in the 1970s, and the future was dread. The future was spies in the sky. The future was CCTVs, or if you're in the US, no knocks, crime blitzes. You know, this is the way we've seen it. And we always thought to ourselves, 1984 was not a sort of guide to the future, and certainly Judge Dredd was not the way you should do it. But there you have virtually what's going on in the United States, mirroring what is happening in Dredd. And before, just one more thing, before you beat yourself up, Pat, O'Neill in martial law, all those broken heroes from the war in the zone was first before the battlefield casualties. I like the bit with the used camo cloak, which is just a shredded hold mess in the army surplus. But yeah, I really enjoyed the brilliance and the irony of martial law.
So, you know how you said that there wasn't any more girl comics? I do agree with that, but that still doesn't mean that girls don't read comics. I actually, there's a Forbidden Planet, which is like a comic shop, really near where I live, and every time I see quite at least 5 girls there and nearly 3 boys. In my school as well, most of the girls, we have this reading time. We're only allowed to read proper books, and I see all the girls, and they're all reading manga, which is basically Japanese comics, that are read backwards and stuff. And I'm here what are you doing? And they're just oh, I'm reading this because I want to. And all the rest of the boys are just reading these really long books and things like that. And then I just look around and like these people, some of the girls here, they have like big stacks of manga that they're just rushing through, skimming through it. And yeah.
Everybody putting their hand up just so I can call some people. Don't be shy, you at the back, sir. Okay, think about it.
I must say I'm quite in awe of Pat being here. I just really 2000 AD was when I was at school. I think my first memory was my mate Daniel, who had these Biotronic stickers stuck to his wrist, and he managed to convince me that I think it was a genuine Biotronic circuit that he had actually implanted in it. but yeah, it wasn't the brightest. But I think 2000 AD represented, I think for us, I mean, I was reading the Beezer and the Victor before 2000 AD, which were both quite staid. The Beezer was a more staid version of the Beano, and the Victor was probably the most staid war comic, I think, of the time. And all of a sudden, 2000 AD sort of exploded onto the scene. And it was a culture shock. It was almost like a mini cultural revolution, I think, although we didn't understand it at the time of what it was really about. And some of the stories were genuinely mind-expanding. I mean, they were. The science fiction was absolutely wild, some of the ideas. And the Tharg's Future Shocks, which was like a one-off story they would do every week with a unexpected ending, a twist, a sort of science fiction story with a twist in the ending. They were almost always, they were very, very thought-provoking. And for me, it gave me a lifelong interest in not just in science, but science fiction, but reading, people like Asimov, and then it sort of led me into actually reading a lot more about science itself. So that's one. I think it gave me a huge interest in all those subjects. And of course, every Sunday I would get 2000 AD on a Sunday, and I would go to. Mum would take us to church before 2000 AD. You see, so we'd have about an hour and a half of church, and it was really stuffy in this church. It was a little Baptist church, and it was a real battle to stay awake because there was very little air, and it always got too hot in there. And the preacher just went on and on and on about Jesus, and then it was straight down the newsagents for my sort of dose of dystopian super violence, really, and so. It really was. It was absolutely. And yes, praise the Lord. And you'd read a comic. You'd be reading a comic after coming out of church with things like sort of a fact file on Tharg, who was the the supposed alien author of 2000 AD, the alien editor of 2000 AD, and sort of the different facts about Tharg. And one of the facts would be, what was Tharg's religion? And it said Tharg doesn't have a religion because all religions are based on Tharg. So this is obviously completely out of the ordinary for the time, I think. So, but I've got a question for you as well, because I think some of Judge Dredd is not just a warning about fascism. I mean, most of the 2000 AD stuff is a lot of it is dystopian, isn't it? Future, awful, different futures, and some of it was actually really terrifying as well. It was very scary, some of the stories and the artwork, particularly Carlos Esquire and the Strontium Dog stories and the pictures of spaceships. Really, I mean, they scared the life out of me, but I kept reading them anyway. But I think my question for you is, some of the Dredd stuff seems as much a celebration of fascist violence as it is a condemnation of fascist violence. I particularly remember one story where Dredd versus the punks, and Dredd has a sort of a long battle with the punks, and he ends up, this is probably about a year or so after punk had sort of been on the scene, 1979 I would say, around that, and Dredd sort of ends up with the punk's hair gripped in his hand, and Dredd's getting the punk's crying at this stage, and he's saying, Dredd's forcing the punk to say, I'm just a cheap, worthless punk, or something like that. That was the end of the story, and there's quite a lot of that in Dredd. So my question is, how much of 2000 AD is not seditious, it actually appeals to people's baser instincts as well?
I'll come back to that at the end.
Yeah. Come right over there. Could I have some more hands so we can cut down. Come on. Put your hand. Yeah, you sir, and then you sir. Come on.
Right, try not to have a panic attack. Right, I was speaking to a couple of friends the other day, and they were quite surprised when I actually mentioned that 2000 AD had been overtly political, and in some ways still is, with stories like, for example, Defoe's background, The Last Leveller, things like that. And I sort of pointed out to them that actually the left has quite a long and proud tradition of subverting traditionally bourgeois or bourgeois-controlled areas, for example, art, literature, music, etc. And that was about it.
Don't be shy. Plenty of time.
No, I just wanted to ask a little bit about the Crisis World War III magazines, because I remember already liking 2000 AD and then getting the chance to get those, 86, 87, something like that when they started. And then they did stop after about 20 episodes, didn't they? Which was a shame. But if people hadn't seen them, you had two, I seem to remember, two running stories. One was a sort of European-type dystopia, and I mean, it was about the idea of we're now in a police state because what's happened is that the British people had misguidedly voted to leave Europe and as a result had faced the wrath of a military reaction from Europe, including the famously named Tariq Ali massacre, where many workers were killed, which I thought was a great name. And I can't remember all the details, but, Tariq Ali massacre certainly stuck in my head. And at the time, that seemed very weird. We were safely in the EU. It was before the single market, so things hadn't really got going. So it's just that idea that they were already about 3 stages ahead in their projections. And then World War III was also a bit like that too. I mean, I think now, when I know a bit more about world politics, I would probably say, well, yes, actually, even in the 80s, the sort of thing that was going on that they were describing, which was kind of an evil Monsanto, McDonald's type corporation, basically running the whole of Latin America like a dictatorial food farm in order to feed the rich world, and the guerrilla struggle that was being fought by the people who were oppressed. And actually, that wasn't that far away from many elements of the present at the time, but I probably didn't realise that. But, certainly the European one, I thought, well, you've really projected on into something very interesting in quite a long way, and that's what made it so interesting, that you've gone a couple of stages ahead and said, not just what happens if this happened, but also what goes a stage further. And it was all very stimulating, and a great shame when it stopped after 20 episodes, as I'm sure you'd agree.
I'll take you after this, Conrad, just to get a bit of gender balance, Conrad.
You didn't ask what my gender was? Just saying. So it is a minefield. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about what I see is quite a positive and progressive side to comics, which is in that we are getting more diverse characters nowadays. But I also wanted to talk about the fragility with which we are able to have those characters. So we have, as was mentioned, Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, the Muslim Desi girl from New Jersey with the massive fists, who is the first Muslim superhero. And the fact that the writers managed to get a woman who fights by growing massive fists to punch people is kind of brilliant. And then we've also got the wonderful Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, who is one of my favourites. So she's an intelligent scientific girl. She's brilliant. She's got fantastic, as well, things that appeal to me, dress sense, hair, everything. And her companion is a massive red T-Rex, and she goes schlumping around, having a great time, and fighting off Hulk, who's an utter dick in this comic. So we've got all of that. You've got Miles Morales, etc., etc. But the fragility with which we are able to access these characters is because the art and the culture that they are produced within is controlled by capitalism. So earlier this year, there was a reported slump in comic sales in America. And comic profits, one of them. And one of the Marvel executives said, "Oh, well, do you know why that is? It's because we're too diverse. Because we've got all these characters from different backgrounds. And do you know what comic book readers really want? They just want incredibly flexible gymnasts with large breasts and men with very big muscles who go in triangles and run around. That's all they want." Of course, there was an outcry and he had to retract it. But I think that speaks to the way that how art which is produced within a capitalist system is not really our own, because it can be taken away within a flash. And there are solutions such as sort of individual publishing and sort of publishing on the internet, but that requires, as well as, obviously there are lots of people who want to do it, but it requires a lot of time to do it, and people have jobs and all that kind of thing. So you're going to have the excess time to make comics and put them on the internet, and most of us need to earn a wage. So I think if we really want to have sort of this artistic flowering of progressive, diverse, seditious, beautiful culture and art, we really are going to need to get rid of the capitalist system. Thanks.
Actually, you first.
I just wanted to say that it always strikes me how easily you kind of forget how the media that you consume in your youth actually goes a long way to developing the way that you look at and process the world. So there's two things I think with respect to that is, first of all, I read Catch-22, which is obviously not a comic, it's a novel, but I read that when I was about 14, and that had a massive effect on how I kind of viewed the world and viewed authority and responded to it, and indeed didn't respond to it. And then I reread it for like 5 straight years after that, and I think I realized later on in my life just how much of an impact that I actually had on me, and I wouldn't have realized that at the time. And I find it fits into something I've heard. I think it might have been Alan Moore talking about the Bo Jeffrey saga, and how it might be the Bo Jeffrey saga, but it's certainly something that he wrote that was a reaction to the likes of the Bash Street Kids and the Beano and or the Dandy or whatever it is. I'm from New Zealand, but my father was born in Liverpool, and one of the random cultural artifacts that he insisted that we consume was, I got the Beano, my brother got the Dandy, and you read those, and he talks about how in those there's this kind of, in the likes of the Bash Street Kids, there's almost this attempt to not crush rebellion, but it ultimately they always go back to the status quo. All of the attempts of subversion from the Bash Street Kids, for example, ultimately wind up coming to naught, and they get their punishment, they get their spanking, and all of that. And certainly he wrote things, as I say, I think it was the Bo Jeffrey saga, I could be wrong, that were a reaction to that. Also, I think with the mentions of fan fiction and also just cheap and easily available ebooks, I think there's a lot of potential with the likes of the webcomic scene. To be fair, I've read a few webcomics, most of them are shit with respect to their politics, but there's certainly potential there. And there's also potential in things like, I don't know if anybody knows Brian K. Vaughan, who is a writer, he did things like Why the Last Man, comics writer and things like that. But he's got a website called Panel Syndicate where he distributes a lot of stuff that's pay what you want. And obviously people don't all grab it for free, and that seems to be, for him at least, an effective way of distributing and bypassing a lot of the mainstream comic books industry. So I think there's a lot of potential in all of that. Anyway, thank you.
Hi, I grew up in the 90s as well as an earlier comrade, and yeah, at this point there wasn't a lot in the way of comic books that I would pick up at all. Most of my introduction to it was a mixture of really old comics that my dad still had stored from sort of the 60s and the 70s. You got your Spider-Mans, your Thors, your Iron Man, etc., etc. So all the black and white English copies, all the ones that unfortunately aren't worth anything today compared to the American ones. It was that, or it was in the library for some reason. In this library in the middle class area, the massive tomes they've made of Judge Dredd in 2000 AD. So that was my first introduction of any sort of remotely comic with any remotely adult themes in it at all. Beyond that, it was purely just the early Spider-Man and Iron Man stuff. That and the Fun Day Times, which comes from the Sunday Times. God save us all. Mickey Mouse mostly couldn't get more sanitized if he tried. Well, this is Disney. But this is Disney after they've removed most of the racism anyway. But beyond that, it was purely just chance that would lead me into that sort of comic regime during the 90s, which was a bit of a was a bit of a shame. It meant that it meant that you didn't get any of the subversion that you would get for, and you only got it later on, which it did come at a good time. Teenage years, I'm quite pissed off at this point, frustrated. I'm not even out of the closet yet, so I want to hit everything in sight. It was a good point for it to come along, but beyond that, I have to ask, which of the two Judge Dredd movies is your favourite? The modern one, the modern one, which I have to admit is a lot. Which I have to admit for that time is a lot more social commentary. All Stallone with it, which is essentially just wee.
Can I have some more hands up, please, after this, comrade? Come on, don't be shy. I know there's lots of comic fans in this room, so, don't hide under the chair and whatever. Come and speak out and have your piece. Otherwise, I'll witter on for 20 minutes and bore you all.
I just wanted to talk quite briefly about my experiences reading 2000 AD and how politically engaging I found it. I mean, I got my first Judge Dredd case file for my 15th birthday. It was basically being forced to me by my dad at that point, but I actually ended up quite enjoying it as I went on. But I think one of the most sort of poignant storylines quite early on is the Apocalypse War, which obviously sees most of Megacity 1 destroyed, 400 million people killed, I believe, in the storyline as a result of a war with East Meg 1, and I think that was quite an explicit commentary on the Cold War. And if I remember correctly, that whole war was essentially started by someone dropping an ice lolly off a balcony, I believe, and that escalated the whole thing into the Apocalypse War. And I think that was quite a sort of biting commentary of the time of how literally these two imperialist powers were ready to go at each other at any given point. And secondly, I just wanted to talk quite briefly about the spin-off, Judge Anderson, obviously the psychic judge. Just a quick point on how I think I see her as being quite a kind of sort of one of the first big feminist icons in terms of the fact that she's not just sort of like sexualized as a lot of women were in comics, and it's not just the fact that I think it's just because basically she's presented as human, she's presented as having doubts and flaws, and yet still being able to carry on with her everyday life and things. And it's just that kind of, there wasn't that kind of presentation prior to that in comics, not that I know of anyway. And that was all I wanted to say, really.
Okay, comrades, come on. We've still got...
Hi, Pa. I come from a place you might know, Dundee. And I was just when I was young. Well, I came from quite a big family. We weren't badly off, but because there was about 8 kids, we didn't really get much share. So getting things like comics, but I had a bit of a cousin that was quite spoiled. I used to get every comic that was going, and he'd save them up. And like maybe once or every 6 months or so, I'd get this sort of baked bean box full up to the brim with comics that I would just absolutely, gorge on. Through and that got me into initially Battle in Action. I would read Victor and stuff like that. To be honest with you, once that box got emptied, I'd go to my sisters and get the Bunty and the Mandy and stuff and start reading. I'd tell you what, hey, you know what I mean? It was all great stuff to read. But 2000 AD was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I was coming to an age where on the back, it was that time of late 70s, early 80s, is the dawn of Thatcherism, and really 2000 AD did connect on a big way about the whole, all the stories. I mean, Judge Dredd, I was never a great fan of Judge Dredd as a character, although some of the storylines, really, because he was really an anti-hero to a certain extent, wasn't he? He was kind of you saw he's kind of he was a straight line kind of thing, despite there was always corruption going on, and he was kind of in the middle of that and stuff like that. But some of the storylines, like somebody mentioned about the Apocalypse War and stuff like that, really exposed the naked capitalism and what it could lead to in terms of it, and that kind of stuff. There was a gritty. It was the world more than anything else. So some of the characters were fantastic. Rogue Trooper was a fantastic story. I used to love that. I mean, the whole thing about you're talking about Charlie's War, but Rogue Trooper was kind of along the same lines. This guy, and I can't remember it because it's a long time since I've read it, but I seem to recall there was, you got dripped in this backstory about the fact that genetic warriors have been created, and they're actually all been massacred and bumped off, and he was kind of the last one left, kind of wandering through this kind of planet of war and desolation, and slowly kind of getting the storylines, but you were actually discovering little bits about it. And that whole kind of the depth of the stories and stuff like that, but against this background of understanding about the how rapacious society can be under capitalism and under kind of regimes that will go to nationalism and war and stuff like that. And that stuck with me. It was a real, it fitted with that kind of period that somebody mentioned, the Cold War and development of Thatcherism and that naked capitalism that you saw during the 80s, and the destruction, and what it did look like the destruction of people's kind of understanding of the world and the way it had been, and that these dystopian futures and stuff like that really made you cling. I wouldn't say it's what made me a socialist. Part of that was the fact my brother joined the SWP, and then I kind of got into discussions with him, but it was the same kind of period as discovery, and me and my mates used to talk about storylines and stuff like that, and it's just a fantastic, I'd just love to thank you, and it was fabulous, and it really did open my eyes. It wasn't the only thing I read, but it made you read, it made you want to read, and that's presumably what you guys were trying to achieve.
I have to say that, for the last 3 days of Marxism, people have been coming up to me and saying, Pat Mills is going to be here. I've grew up reading his stuff. I mean, the amount I couldn't get a bloody meal at break times because I kept being interrupted by that. Anybody else want to put their hands up and speak out? Yes, comrade at the back. Anybody else while he's making his way up? Don't be shy. Yes, Gordon, lovely. Come on up. Brilliant.
Hello, thank you. It's just a brief compliment, really. As much of the content and subject matter, the artwork in 2000 AD was really revolutionary for me. Seeing that, particularly giving that you gave that a platform, and it. I'm thinking particularly of Simon Bisley and the Black Hole story, the ABC Warriors, and I think it was the artwork in that, the dynamism and the way it like broke through what is conventional comic styles. It's just a compliment again that you gave a platform for artists like that in a kind of in a comic in the UK at that time. Thanks.
When Pat was talking about the experience of taking ideas to BBC script editors, junior producers and stuff like that, the first couple of conversations, people sound like they're really interested. It gets passed up the line, then the interest starts to dissipate, and then there's a long silences and all the rest of it. And I'd like to give you the other side of that, because for my job, for the last best part of 30 years, I've had to traipse along to bosses' conferences. Many of them are big media conferences, television executives. And one of the things they've been moaning about, almost without exception for the last 20 years, is the lack of diversity in their workforce. In fact, there are very few black employees in television, especially at the level of what they call the creative talent, at the level of commissioners and so on. They complain about the fact that the voices that they want to buy, to write new scripts, come up with new characters and all the rest of it, is getting less and less interesting to what they know their audiences want. And they wonder, where does this conservatism come from? Because they moan about a problem, and yet it gets worse year after year. After all, these are the very same people who run the industry and have now made it so hard to get into television, unless your parents are rich enough to sub you for a year. If you can't do an unpaid internship for 6 months, you're not going to get into television. You're not going to get a diversity of voices, especially from working class voices, if the way that you have to approach is being rejected for 15 years when you put in script ideas. Now, it occurs to me that I'm just going to talk about television and then ask a question about a different industry, which is publishing and comics. in television and film, you can see at least there's some logic to it. It's conservative because these are very expensive productions. They don't like making mistakes. But that thing about junior producers, talent scouts, yeah, they're always, not always, often they're going to be very pleased to come across new voices. Then it gets passed up the chain and people make decisions about, well, would we really get off with making this? This is a bit edgy, something like that. I'm often reminded about a conversation I had once about what was once the most expensive film ever made, which was Titanic. Now, most of us think of that as a pretty sappy story. But remember what The Economist, which I treat as a religious magazine mainly, wrote about it in its review. He said, this was a bracingly Marxist film. Now, this is the other side of the pressure on people making creative decisions about what they'll show on our television screens or on our cinema screens. They face this pressure about they want new voices, they want to reflect the interests and concerns of their largely working class audience. But as soon as they actually start making a decision about what are we going to fund, the other people talking to them talk about their real interests. Yeah, their ruling class's interest in what they would like us to be watching. And that's where the loss of confidence, I think, comes from. Now, I said it's relatively easy to understand it in an expensive thing like television and film. What, to me, is not so easy to understand is why something that's as cheap as making a comic, the same lack of confidence comes through. And I can only put it down to just owners hate taking risks. And the whole thing about comics is that they look risky. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons that they have withered away in Britain. And once gone, nobody wants to invest in bringing them back. Now, in France, that's not the case. Bande dessinée is still around. Well, not all of them, but it's not as dire as it is here. And I suspect it comes down to just this ruling class lack of confidence in taking a risk unless they're guaranteed to make the money back. It's ultimately cowardice. It's nothing to do with creativity. It's just, and if they can't make money out of it, they really don't want to know.
Yeah, so when I was 9, my older brother came home with a new comic that had just come out called Action. And for those of you who don't know about Action, it was a colossally violent comic. It really was quite horrific. We loved it. Completely addicted to it. The front pages were absolutely amazing. I remember there was this one particularly storyline about a disease that meant everybody over 16 died, and so the kids were just sort of fending for themselves. And I think before it got banned, which I want to come on for a minute, the last thing that actually happened is a bunch of people came in, a bunch of other young kids came in and started beating up all these kids. Like, what's going on? Oh, we're trainee coppers. And that's who it was. That's why it sort of seemed to end with the police assaulting these people. Anyway, unfortunately, Action came under quite a lot of pressure and moral outrage, led by Frank Boff, who was, as we all know, was sacked for taking cocaine in brothels from his job. But he was very concerned that Action was corrupting the morals of young people like myself. So anyway, in the end, I believe that W.H. Smith and various people put a lot of pressure on the publishers to pull the comic, and it returned a little bit later in a much toned down way. And of course, we all just stopped reading it at all because we love Tom and Jerry, and I think the Simpsons have parodied it in Itchy and Scratchy lots and lots. Really enjoyed the violence of it. But what I'd really like to hear from Pat, thank you for that, by the way, but what I'd really like to hear is a little bit of an insider's take on the way those wheels kind of turned to essentially have what was an extremely popular and brilliant comic removed from circulation because of the sort of moral outrage, and perhaps how you experience that, and any dirt that you've got to dish on those people. Actually,
would love to. Yeah, Mary Whitehouse didn't like Action either, and the House of Parliament were outraged just before they went and bombed somewhere, I think.
Hi. I work in a county library, so I hope you won't now all glaze over and go to sleep because you think libraries are boring. Where I work, we keep last copies of books in the local authority, and it's in Hampshire, which is very Tory. But we were told we are not to keep things like graphic novels if they come to us from the branches, because usually they get stolen. Because as somebody mentioned, they're quite expensive things, and we buy quite a lot. It's not 2000 AD, sadly. But yeah, people pilfer them off library shelves. So if they do come to us, we're still told it's not very good quality material. We're not to keep it, and I think that's totally wrong. So I would like them to sort of treat it as a decent sort of, alternative literature. If young people read, it's better to read anything than to be turned off reading, and libraries are part of, the library rant. Libraries are part of everybody having access to materials, and as people said, they're expensive things, so people can go to the library and for free you could borrow anything you bloody like, whether it's a Tolstoy or whether it's 2000 AD as a magazine, whatever, that should be available. Plus, on top of that, we've got a £500,000 cut to our budget, so we're going to be bringing down the level of what we have for the public. It's all about access to literature, access to any materials that people enjoy or learn from, whatever the hell it is. Reading is key. Reading is crucial to our society, and libraries, please, are part of it. It's not just what the material is; it's how people can access it. Thank you.
Okay. If there's nobody else who wants to speak, I'm going to ask Pat to come back. But just before I do, I want to have a brief word to say how grateful I am that he's come over. He's come a long way to speak to us today. I think this has been a marvellous meeting. And I want to reiterate, especially after what the last comrade said, I want to reiterate what Pat represents. I think it was Kevin O'Neill who said this man is the gentleman tailor of comic writers. He doesn't just churn them stuff out. He's bespoke tailor. The characters he's created are loved, and I think the people that think about the characters that he's created, George the Colossus of Mars, Charlie of North Pole, all those people, Charlie in Charlie's War, they stick with us because he spent time over them, because he's a craftsman, and I want to thank him as well for the work that he's done as well. So thank you very much. And Please stick around. Please buy one of the books. I think, great laugh. And come and join us for a drink afterwards. Thanks very much.
Hi. That's some. Thank you everybody for those really great points. Probably should start with Dredd, I guess, shouldn't I? God, what can I say about that? The various questions. Which Dredd movie? That scene of Dredd versus punks. I guess it comes down to this, and it's probably too big a subject to go into, or I can happily rant about it later over a drink if anyone's interested. Dredd's a flawed character. He's not right. And there's... when I say not right, it's more than just the satire. It's the way the character was put together. That there are inherent flaws in it, and rather like someone was saying about publishers and their crappy attitude, they're never going to go there and never going to look at it because all their interest is just pure greed. But because there's a flaw in the actual creating of Dredd, which would take a while to go into, and I just try and sum it up in one paragraph. That flaw pursues it through those two movies. It's why the Stallone movie isn't right. It's why the second movie didn't sell. Although fans love it, it didn't sell to the kid in the street. And no one will look at it. And it's only somewhere like here I get a chance to talk about it, because people in the industry never ask me this question because they don't want to hear the answer. It's a flawed character. And there's any number of flaws in it, but one of them is, I think it's fair to say that I basically developed Dredd, which means that certainly in the early Dredds, I think 75% of his persona comes from me, and he's based on a very flawed teacher. I won't go too far down this road. I went to Catholic school of Christian brothers. So, do I really need to get into this subject? No, not really. And so that's, that flaw in his persona. I got over that flaw because I also used this particular teacher as the basis for Torquemada in Nemesis. And you'll notice the difference. And they're actually, Dredd and Torquemada are really two branches off the same tree, of that same persona. And what you'll see with Torquemada is I humiliate him, I make him look stupid, I make him look a complete prat. And they don't do that with Dredd, and they're wrong, because they're making this fucking fascist, on occasion, appeal to people who really should know better. And it's only a minority, it's only a relative minority, but there's nothing, when I wrote Torquemada, there's nothing I enjoyed better than making him look a complete arsehole. Because it's really, otherwise, what are we saying? We're saying that these fascist guys are all-powerful. And what we have to do, I feel, is we show them presenting themselves as all-powerful, and then we show them cut down. Now, they don't ask me to write Dredd these days, and you can probably guess why, because what I would do, for example, just off the top of my head, I might look at Ceausescu or some other, there's plenty of fascists the world over, and see what happened to them, and attempt to cut down the judges. I mean, I actually built up the whole history of the judges, but I would certainly go into making them look wrong. And the evidence that the majority of readers would welcome that comes with a story like Chopper, which was really revered by the readers, because here for the first time it's this kid saying to the judge, screw you, and the judge is like, and I can't really remember the entire outcome, but I remember the feeling at the time was that the kids were thinking, yeah, he's going to finally beat this authority figure. And that should have been an ongoing thing, that endlessly beating authority. And unfortunately they didn't. So there's a lot more to it than that, but that's my feeling on Dredd. Another important thing, we're talking about manga, and this is actually really important. There are some good mangas which aren't read back to front. The French do other kind of manga stories. They are generally light and frothy, and they don't have, to my way of thinking, the kind of solid storylines that we're kind of very renowned for with British comics. But they flow better, and I think we actually need to learn a lot from manga. I still think that there is something intrinsically, our British way of looking at things is very separate to manga. But what I would also say is I've done, I must be at least 6 classes talking to students who do graphic novel courses. And the majority of the students are women. And so that's really encouraging. It's quite remarkable. 75% of the class are female. So that's got to impact in the long run, I think, on comics for the future. So I think that's a really good thing. We didn't really get a chance to talk about black issues, but I noticed on Third World War, we were fine when we had stories set in South America. But once we started doing the Third World War in Brixton, and to get over all the inevitable problems I could have got, I thought, God, if I try writing this on my own, I'm going to get screwed, especially if I came to somewhere like here, right? So I got a black co-writer, and we wrote them together. So we were able to say things that probably couldn't have been said otherwise. And there was resistance from this would be early 90s. Resistance from that kind of what you might call white, Guardian-loving readership. No, there was a real problem with and that was one of the reasons why Third World War died. One of the reasons. That we were getting into all kinds of interesting stuff. We even did the Nestle baby food scandal, which was... But my feeling was, well, they've let me loose on this. I'm just going to go for it, It's like, I mean, we've all of us talked about some of these crappy comics around, and again, coming back to the if you like, the democracy of comics, which is so important, and the way that capitalism, if Third World War, Third World War was fairly successful. If it had made a bit more money, it'd probably still be running. Capitalists wouldn't care. I could be slagging off Unilever and Nestle and all the others. As long as it's making money, they don't care, which is, I think that's their flaw. That's their soft underbelly. And I don't know, maybe I should have been a little more subversive in the way I approached it. But, how do you sort of do it any other way other than telling it like it is when you're dealing with something like the Nestle baby food scandal? Or you can't just say, oh, well, that's not for guys, they're not interested. Well, why wouldn't they be, But there are ways around this problem of the expense of comics. And, someone was saying how it is very labor-intensive and we've all got day jobs and so forth. One solution is an anthology. Anthologies, if you look at 2000 AD, it's an anthology. If anyone ever does go down the anthology route, though, make sure it has a tight theme. A lot of comics have died because they don't have a theme. People think, we have a comic with something for everyone. It doesn't work that way. The standard has to be high, and you have to have a very strong theme. And if you do an anthology, it means that your individual labor is perhaps plausible. In other words, you put in, let's say 3 or 4 months in your spare time. And Comixology is one option. Now, that's Amazon, so you can't get any more capitalist than that. But they do accept stories from... It's no longer the controlled by Random House or whatever. So, yeah, you can bring out your own comic. And, of course, you can also put it up on a website with a PDF or I think it's called CBZ for a kind of comic-directed style, link up to PayPal, and you can make money. And in a way, this takes us back, actually, to the very, very beginning of comics, which actually is before the Penny Dreadful, which takes us back to the 17th century, to chapbooks, which I read about in Defoe, where you've got all these chap books means cheap books. So that they were, and that's really how comics and how popular culture should be. So there could be any subject under the sun. And I think that has to be the way forward. I think the internet is a way to get around this, because I think where 2000 AD is concerned, I don't see them being concerned about that scene about Dredd screwing a punk down into the ground. That's not a scene I would have written, and I think that reflects, if you like, that's John Wagner probably being in a very cynical mood at the time. He's not political, but his cynicism acts as a kind of political perspective, which is why you have some really wonderful stories, all those fat guys and all that kind of stuff. But it's very much a personal journey for him, and I would say a very Scottish journey. He's very dour. So that's the other aspect of Dredd. But, when that was described, I felt a real chill. I can remember that scene. And I can't even say it was later in the Dredd history. It was quite early, wasn't it? That one, say it, punk, I'm just a cheap punk. They really should have been an antidote to that scene. So you can show Dredd as being a complete scumbag, and then you can show... somebody getting his own back on it in some way. It doesn't mean that you lose the impact of the character. And there are people who are really obsessed about Dredd in a slightly unhealthy way. I think they have their own chapter houses and things. I'm not quite sure how that works or what that's all about. And I cite an example in this book where I always remember one guy saying... he was going to base his life on Judge Dredd. There's a long tradition of this, apparently. Peter Cushing based his life on Tom Merry, the public school boy. And so this guy who based his life on Judge Dredd, I can still remember that letter coming into the office. And he was saying that whatever decisions he made in life, he would say, what would Judge Dredd do in this situation? And so I suggested in the book that would give the initials a bit like what would Jesus do, WWJDD. You know, in other words, he'd have a T-shirt with that on there. So yeah, it is chilling, and I think that is the downside of satire. I think it's also my reservation about science fiction. When I did Action, I'll come back to it just in a sec, just for a couple of sentences on it. I was aware that when we did 2000 AD, it was a retreat. We would be safe. And that's the drawback, I think, to science fiction. It's just robots. It's in a galaxy far, far away. There's nothing to worry about. And so we got away with an awful lot. But with Action, it was much more hard-hitting. And the reason it died was, well, several reasons, but essentially because it came out in too much of a rush. There was no time to step back and see where we were going wrong and where we were going right and all the rest of it. And someone was asking about the dirt on it. Well, one happy memory I can share with you, I commuted from Colchester up to IPC every day. And Mary Whitehouse also lived in Colchester, and I can always remember she was on the train sitting opposite me, and she was kind of scowling at me, probably because I had long hair or sort of clothes she wouldn't have approved of. And I was editing an action script, I think it was a hook jaw, and I just wrote in more blood and gore, and looking at her and thinking, this one's for you, Mary. Thank you very much.